Now, this is a relatively new book for you. What was the inspiration for writing it? I know your background. You've done some other things as well. How did you come to even start thinking about the pattern instinct?
Yeah, well, sure. Yeah, well, as you said, the subtitle is A Cultural History of Humanity's Search for Meaning. And for me, really, the book emerged out of my own personal search for meaning. Because as you kind of alluded to, the first part of my life, I was actually doing very different stuff. I actually was a founder of an internet company during that first internet phase, and actually took it public and was really living a very different life. And then a lot of the things I'd built kind of crashed around me. My wife at the time, she passed away some years back. She became very sick. I left the company to look after her. The company then basically collapsed within a year or two. And it felt like the things I'd built my life around were kind of crashing. And even my wife that I looked after for a number of years then was in cognitive decline, so I kind of lost her, really, even while she was still alive. And I went through this phase of realizing I could build my life going forward in a place that was truly meaningful. But what was that? So I started my own search. So it really came out of my own personal desire to understand, not just take what was given as these received ideas of what meaning is, but really understand for myself, what is really a meaningful life? And what do other cultures say about that? And then as I started to sort of peel the onion, if you will, I got more and more into looking at sciences, because whatever I did with my life going forward, I wanted it to be truly rigorous intellectually, as well as feeling that it was deeply meaningful spiritually. So I got kind of stuck in a lot of reductionist science ideas of, when we really look at our life as really meaningless. But in my heart, I didn't feel that was right. But then kept looking, and then kept starting to find some of what I see as some of the answers in traditional indigenous and then traditional Chinese thought, and started to discover systems and complexity science too. And these things began to cohere in a way for me.
It's so funny, because I mean, my search is just similar in that I was searching for meaning in my own life, and I go down this rabbit hole of ideas, and it's funny that we all come out, not all, but a lot of people come out and we're like, oh yeah, like this is really important. Like complexity science is really important. Taoism is really important. The Upanishads is a great read. Everyone should read the Bhagavad Gita, like understand like Brahman and Atman and all these things. They're like really cool ideas. And I'm so excited. Like what Matthew and I are trying to do here is to help seed these ideas into the zeitgeist. And with your book, you've so beautifully wrapped it into this experience of like, okay, here they are. This is it, guys.
I think one of the core thematics in the book that might help us kind of start with the broader brushstrokes and perhaps go from there is this notion of culture shaping values and then value shaping history. This notion that there is this reciprocity between the course of history, the course of action, and the culture in which we're embedded, and that when separate cultures have their own perhaps evolutionary paths, their own distinct behaviors or rituals or customs, that shapes literally the universe of action and choice in a way that can be invisible. So maybe talk a little bit about that, and like especially maybe the dichotomy as you see it between East and West, or the different paths they took.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. That's a great place to sort of start to dig in. And as you know, the book begins with what I see as one of these iconic stories of around that whole issue of how culture shapes history, because actually a lot of modern historians say the opposite. Like the kind of the mainstream current approach to history, the people like Jared Diamond got set in place, and he wrote some great work and did a great job of pulling history away from this kind of cultural essentialism that it was stuck in for basically centuries in the Western mind, which is this idea that somehow there was something better about the European worldview, which made Europe and America more successful and all this stuff. So he kind of took this away and looked at history at this what it was known as geographic determinism. Actually, people are the same everywhere, but the geography leads to different ways in which people evolve. So that idea is a powerful one, a step forward. But then people got really stuck in this notion of thinking that human beings are the same everywhere, and that the only thing that shapes history is how the geography works.
Right.
But what they're really doing, actually, that's another form of cultural imperialism. They're applying modern Western values and beliefs about human nature and saying that's what people are all across the board, not realizing that they're stuck in their own frame. Mm-hmm. So this kind of story I'm looking at it goes back into the 15th century, and we all know that in 1492 Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and discovered the new
meme
world.
is deeply embedded.
Yeah, exactly. And we go, okay, well that's how the modern world began, and imperialism, etc. But so what very few people know is that earlier in that same century, in the early 1400s, there was this Chinese Admiral Zheng, who basically commanded an armada of about 300 massive ships, so big that you could have fit 10 of Columbus's boats into one of Zheng's boats. This huge armada, something like 27,000 people in this armada. He sailed the Indian Ocean for about 30 years, basically owned the place. He could go to East Africa, Arabia, Sri Lanka, and he was treated like a god in some places because they had so much power. But he didn't choose to do what Columbus did when when Columbus landed in the West Indies, he looked at how the indigenous people seemed so naive and so vulnerable. They didn't even know what a sword was. And he wrote back to the King and Queen of Spain, with just a few people, we could take control of them all and bring them all back as slaves to Spain. He was instantly focused on this notion of exploitation, of using power to disrupt whatever they saw and just basically exploit the people and the land. But Zheng had a very different worldview. His view was the sense of harmonious equilibrium. So he definitely thought that China was like the numero uno, and so he'd want to bring ambassadors. He'd find the prince of whatever area, bring them back to China to kowtow to the emperor, recognize how great China was. But it wasn't about exploiting. He could have, if he'd wanted to, enslaved entire populations, mined the wealth, but he didn't choose to. In fact, when there was piracy, he would take his forces and get control of the pirates. So his notion was that the reason for having power was to maintain harmony, to keep things in a place of equilibrium for human flourishing, rather than exploit. But of course, none of us have ever heard of Admiral Zheng, and everyone knows of Columbus. So somehow, that Western approach of exploitation became because of the success in how it basically dominated the world, has become what we think of as the de facto approach to the world, which is really unique to a particular culture.
Do you think that's perhaps because, it seems as if what you're saying, and please correct me if this is an incorrect characterization, is that there might still have been some element of imperialism there, but it might have been it's an integrative imperialism to some extent, or like a more harmonious meshing of that contact surface area between someone exploring or moving into new territory and those who existed before. And that might be more nuanced and balanced, but it's also perhaps slower and more delicate. And the Western cultural imperative was more move forward as quickly and forcefully as possible to invade the space and completely replace what is there.
Yes.
And therefore, maybe it outcompetes the other in the short term, but causes a lot of harm in the long term.
Yeah, I think you're really right on in what you're saying. And something that comes out of what you're saying, it's really important to emphasize. And I try to touch on this a few times in the book, but sometimes when I get so excited talking about some of these other cultures, it gets misinterpreted, is there's no golden age in some past. And no matter, as I'm looking at that contrast, somebody could hear me sort of imply that what I'm saying is Zheng's approach was the right one and Columbus's was the wrong one. But, China at that time was imperialist, hugely hierarchical, hugely patriarchal. You know, one of the most just hugely unequal, just like so many, in fact, virtually every agrarian society, agrarian civilization in history. So we don't want to sort of view that as some sort of, they had the answer and we got to get back to that answer. More than anything, I think, is that we can look at these different cultural frames for clues, for this recognition that very few people have in today's world, that there are other worldviews, there are other ways of making sense of the world than the one that is pounded into our brains from when we're just infants and we just see all around us. I think that's, if there's just one message people take away from reading my book, I'd be satisfied if that was just the message, the recognition there are other ways of making sense of things.